Hi, everyone. My name is Sixto Cancel, and I want to welcome everyone here to the Young People's Address of the Nation 2020 State of the Union edition. As I said, I'm Sixto Cancel. I am your co-MC for tonight, and I am excited to be here and being joined by Jeremy.
Thanks, Sixto. Hi, everyone. My name is Jeremy Veramendi, host of the Divergent College Vibes podcast and a third-year undergrad from UC Merced. For those watching, thank you for tuning in into our second Young People Address the Nation event. Today, we'll be elevating youth voices across America in reaction to President Biden's 2022 State of the Union address. In just a few minutes, we'll be joined by 30 speakers across 26 states, sharing their responses as young people to the nation.
So tonight we're going to keep it authentic. We're going to hear from 30 folks from all across the country. And as we push forward, we want to start with a disclaimer that the perspectives of each of the speakers are their own. You'll hear from them. They do not represent the views of this event or our partners and everyone who's been involved. But we wanted to create a space where we have real talk so we can have real understanding. So if you would like to join us from home, head over to youngpeopleaddress.org and engage with us online using our hashtag, and I'll pass it to Jeremy to kick off the night.
Thanks, Sisto. To kick off tonight's discussion, we're joined by the following: Addie from Bennington, Vermont, Grant from Austin, Texas, Kyle from Manchester, Connecticut, and last but not least, Michelle from Orange County, California, to speak on democracy and civic engagement. Let's begin with some initial reactions to the State of the Union.
I guess I'll go first. So my initial reactions, I was happy to see that Biden launched a variety of bipartisan tactics. I think we all noticed that it was very clear that he was trying to go full on representative of both parties. But I did expect stronger backing for progressive ideals, especially because of his promises with his campaign, particularly with border control and police reform.
Absolutely. Anybody else? And what were your expectations, from President Biden's 2022 State of the Union address, and what would you like to see more covered?
Initially, President Biden obviously went in depth a lot about the economy, and trying to promote, American-grown manufacturing and creating job opportunities. But I felt that the issues that were really impacting middle class and low income families were kind of shrouded in darkness to some extent and weren't brought out as much as they could have been. And that, Biden did little to address the racial injustice which is plaguing our society today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, Addie, we have been more than 2 years into the COVID-19 pandemic, and it seems so that the state of our American democracy seems to be in a tumbling position, especially when we are currently dealing with a geopolitical tension and a humanitarian crisis abroad. What do you think President Biden must continue to address, as we are heading into 2022 and coming on to the midterms?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like there's a lot more that Biden should be addressing. As Kyle said, I think racial justice is one really huge thing, and I would have loved to see Biden talk about that a bit more, and talk about police reform and reparations and addressing things like the wealth gap and the legacy of redlining that are still so pervasive in our country. I think he needs to do more to address that. And I think also poverty is something he should do more to address. He talked a lot about our involvement with like Ukraine, which is awesome and really important. But I think he also needs to focus on more domestic issues such as addressing poverty and addressing racial justice. So I'd love to see him kind of talk more about that.
And last but not least, GE, what more concerns about President Biden's presidential agenda as we are heading into the midterm elections, especially when it comes to addressing the inequities that young people are dealing with, especially from around home?
Absolutely. Well, taking points from the other panelists, when we look at the nonpartisan tactics and when we have areas where we need to talk more about race, and even tapping into critical race theory, and how that's taught in our education. For me, it all starts at education. And I do believe that when we do look at the address and when we have our hopes of how our communities can build and how we envision them, that we need to focus on, of course, that educational aspect and how we teaching and how we learning and how we applying these to our communities and building. So I know for me that back to as I said before, I'm taking points on the nonpartisan tactics and looking at those areas where we can improve.
Absolutely. And especially when we are dealing with some domestic uncertainty lying around, the lack of universal pre-K, the inevitable costs of childcare, and especially when it comes to not being able to afford an equitable healthcare plan to this day. And so as we are awakening, into the third phase of the COVID-19 pandemic, not only we are becoming adaptable to to COVID-19 overall, but we're also looking at other ways to elevate young people, at the extent of which accountability matters at all costs. Um, and Sixto, I turn it back to you to lead into the next topic.
Thank you. I want to thank the panelists who just came on. We're going to have more folks coming in. And as we do so, I just want to acknowledge that we talked about civil rights, we talked about democracy, and it is a very complicated issue as we see around the world, folks fighting for democracy. We still have work to do here. And with that, I would say, now let's talk about foreign policy and immigration. We have Apika Shea from Iowa, Arushe from Minneapolis, Isaac from Switzerland, and Jonathan from New York City. So we're going to invite those folks here to the stage here, and we're going to hear from them. What were some of their reactions around foreign policy and immigration? And as we do so, I'll go ahead and pause here to just acknowledge that, I was glad to see the president acknowledge the oppression that the Ukrainian people are going through. And yet I also wished that we would have had some acknowledgement around the people of color who today are in Ukraine and the reports on social media of folks who are of African descent having difficulties being able to leave the country and access some of the same resources. So tonight we're going to go ahead and invite Isaac up. And Isaac, I want to hear some of your reactions.
Yeah, so can everyone hear me? Great. So one of my reactions was, one of the first things Biden mentioned when talking about Ukraine was the right of students to retirees to teachers defending their homeland. And one of my first thoughts is how that's often never given to other people around the world fighting other kinds of oppression. So this summer we saw an unbelievable attack by Israel on the Palestinians, and that right was never given to them. And he talked about destroying the Russian economy and sinking their currency. And we should be aware that when we're talking about destroying another country's economy, there are innocent civilians in that economy as well who are really, really suffering. So I think it's important to remember when we look at the injustices in the world to keep in comparison and think about what we can do to move the situation forward and not just cause more harm.
Isaac, thank you for so much for lifting that up. I want to pass over to Rishi. Tell me a little, and forgive me if I pronounce that wrong, but I would love to hear your reactions.
Yeah, kind of similar to what Isaac said. I think it was really interesting how Biden was talking about the impact that his sanctions will have on the Russian economy. I also think it was really interesting how he brought up Russia's oligarchs, because study after study has shown that sanctions don't really impact the rich and powerful people of the country. They only really have an economic impact on the working class people of the country that they're being targeted towards, right? And I think we need to remember that working class Russians did not have anything to do with Putin's actions, and Biden's sanctions are only going to immiserate the Russian working class. And I also think it's important to remember how integrated Russia's economy is with the international economy, right? So a lot of countries across Africa and the Middle East rely on trade with Russia for food, and Biden sanctions are also going to hurt people across those countries. A lot of European countries rely on Russia for gas. I think 40% of Europe's gas actually comes from Russia. So these sanctions are really just going to have a devastating impact across the board.
I want to thank you for that. We're going to bring in Jonathan into the mix here. We're gonna bring in some more folks into the mix here. Jonathan, take us away. What was some of your reactions when it comes down to foreign policy?
Yeah, I think it was extremely disappointing to see how Biden responded to the immigration crisis that's happening in our country right now. I didn't really expect that. He had a very centralist point of view, especially when it came to the border. We actually heard some congressmen in the background shouting, "Build the wall." And I think that just shows how Trump era policy is remaining in Biden's administration. I think that Biden is failing to respond to the immigration crises that's happening right now, and strengthening our border, adding new surveillance to the southern border won't really address any issues that are going on. And I'm just very disappointed to how Biden addressed the topic on immigration, especially when he talked about the pathway for citizenship. And he failed to recognize how ICE has, over-policed immigrant communities. And so those are just some of my few reactions off of what Biden said today.
And we'll pass it over to you.
Oh, thank you, Sixto.
No, I'm not gonna. Just one.
Oh,
wait,
right. Sorry.
We have one more voice to get in here.
One more. Okay.
Yep. Ashiko.
I think I'm supposed to go now. Sorry.
Yes.
I think okay. So yeah, my name is Apeksha. That's how you pronounce my name. But yeah.
Sorry. So tell us a little bit about your. We just heard a little bit about foreign policy and immigration. What were some of your reactions and of tonight's State of the Union?
The thing is, like Jonathan had mentioned, President Joe Biden kind of over the whole immigration thing, especially with the build the wall and whatnot. But also, like, there's a lot of xenophobia and racism that are still happening with foreign policy and immigration here, and especially with the rise of like Asian hate and Black Lives Matter and all those other movements. We kind of see him just like not talk about it. I mean, those two movements didn't happen that long ago, and also like even with those movements happening, he kind of just didn't talk about it at all. So that was really disappointing to hear. And also, my other thought was, he spent I can see and I understand why President Biden spent a lot of time talking about Ukraine, because that is like the war that's happening, right? But he barely mentioned or talks about or even puts a lot of like Middle Eastern countries and others at a bad light. And we see that a lot with the journalism that's happening, where people are calling Middle Eastern people like uncivilized and other bad words and rhetoric. So it's really disappointing to see how President Biden just doesn't mention those things at all.
All right, we got 1 minute left here. So I think we've heard a lot about disappointment, but I wondered, was there anything that stood up that you would say, hey, you were right on the money on this piece? You did anything that anybody saw on the positive note to play devil's advocate?
I can think of one thing, which is when he said that our forces will not get involved and that NATO will not be a part of this war. And I think as heartbroken as we are, it's important to remember that if NATO enters this war, that means a nuclear war, which is the worst thing for humanity that is possible. So I think we should support Biden in saying that US troops and NATO troops should not be a part of this war in any circumstance.
I want to thank this panel for talking about foreign policy and immigration, and I'm going to pass it back to Jeremy on the next to introduce the next panel here.
Thanks, Sisto. So the next topic we have ready in our table is education. Joining us tonight and our panelists are Aria from Delaware County, Pennsylvania, Juan from Hartford, Connecticut, Tamara from Atlanta, Georgia, and Isaac from Fort Worth, Texas. Aria, let me start with you here. What are some of your thoughts on what was mentioned by President Biden when it comes to education policy overall? What were some of the loopholes that remained in place, since the past 4 years? And what are you looking forward to see President Biden address, in the upcoming year, especially in the midterms?
I think, unfortunately, the way our US government has functioned for many, many years is that education has never been prioritized over, our defense spending budget in regards to how much money we put towards it. So I think at this point, we take what we can get. And I was glad that he did mention HBCUs, even if it was just an attention grabbing word that he decided to throw in. I think it is important that even though he didn't necessarily mention the amount of money he's putting in, he did mention talking about we need to prioritize the resources for HBCUs. We need to prioritize those with less resources, which has been something necessary with racial inequality, just prioritizing the people without those resources. We need to give them the money in order to do that. And so I am glad that he is starting to allocate some of those funds, even if it isn't the highest priority. So it was a bit disappointing in regards to, you can kind of tell what his priorities are based off of how much he talks about them in the State of the Union. And that kind of got left out in comparison to, obviously, the Ukrainian conflict is very important, but in regards to things like the immigration issue, he didn't focus on education that much. I was, however, I was excited in a sense because of the amount of time and efforts he's putting into allocating towards students and mental health issues. I do think, this is coming kind of late, especially how rapidly mental health issues are becoming more apparent in the United States, especially because of the COVID-19 pandemic and a bunch of other things. I am very glad that he's recognizing that and at least starting to put in some effort to get that done.
Now, I want to dive deep further into the political battle amongst, determining whether the next phase of education policy will go next, and that is on school boards. Just recently, we have witnessed, across the country, school boards becoming dominated by parents who are seeking to gain independence for determining, determining what content will their children learn. And the main factor that is very triggering to most of America right now was critical race theory. We have heard from both sides of the aisle, simply placing the debate on what a child should learn at school at stake. So what should be the direction here from the Biden administration in terms of, giving the opportunity for all young people who are enrolled in school to be not only be safe in school, but also, to be equally represented when it comes to what they're learning?
I think one of the main important things is that we need to focus on is when we don't learn our history, it's bound to repeat itself. I think that's one main thing that needs to be really thought about when we talk about critical race theory, because if we remove that from students' educations, and I think everybody can agree on this, they're not going to be aware of how racial injustice has affected our country and our society for decades, for centuries. They're not going to have any awareness of that, and they're going to go into our world blind. And when they see older generations acting upon the same things that have been a problem, they're going to accept it as normal because they won't have that education. They won't have the knowledge that they need to recognize what's wrong. And I'm not saying that in schools they should be taught what's politically correct to say or things like that. But I think knowing the basic history and being able to understand what the US has done wrong, what our society has done wrong in the past is crucial in order to form another generation of kids that can act upon these issues better.
Absolutely. And I want to bring in Isaac Espinal and Tamara Morgan. Well, first of all, thank you very much for being here today. And I just wanted to start off by hearing your reactions as to how President Biden was, tackling on, education reform since the day he got into office. And what were some of the things you saw, him state in his State of the Union, and what were some of the things that you didn't see? Isaac, let me start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I look at throughout Biden's campaign administration, I think it's a little bit disappointing just because I think he really went into it with promises of student debt relief and a focus on education, which I don't think a lot of people have seen. He didn't even talk about student debt in this whole address, but at the same time, he did focus on community college and the value of that, right? But I think it was more highlights throughout the address instead of actionable steps. For example, he never talked about undocumented students or TAFSA or, federal aid that can come from the government on a national scale to help these people achieve the dreams of higher education or trade, right? So for me, it was a mixed bag of, I'm glad you mentioned education here and there, but you didn't talk about actionable steps, nor really mention any of the promises that you mentioned to become elected. And just to kind of bounce off Aria and critical race theory, I think, when I look at the election boards or just school boards in general, it's this politicization of this concept that's so important. And I think a lot of people talk about it but have no idea, or just tune into whatever media they come in, and they come in screaming but not really understanding that it's important, especially as part of Gen Z and kids all the way in kindergarten, to really understand both perspectives. So even if circling back maybe to Dreamers, once again, that focus of not only maybe citizenship but like they're achieving to higher education, and this focus on it, I think was barely hit on, but he could have expanded more, especially understanding the promises that he made to be elected. So those are some thoughts.
Tamara, how about you?
Hi, Tamara. And kind of like what Isaac said, he didn't really speak much about education, and when he got elected, none of those promises really came to light. What he did mention was that he talked about students being able to attend school and aligning that value with COVID-19 and how that's affecting, children in schools. What he did not talk about was what goes on inside the classroom. And Isaac, I'm glad you brought up critical race theory, because along with that point, students demand to have culturally inclusive pedagogy taught inside of schools. They demand to have the truth. So not only is it important to have truth inside those classrooms, it is very important to have identity. You have students who you wouldn't know what students talk about because adults don't ask. They think that you have the adults speaking for them. You have parents showing up at school boards speaking for the child, and the child knows nothing about it. The harm that they think is going to happen is only going to have students of color embrace such curriculum that they wouldn't even know what happened, because once again, textbooks are being colonized, which they need to be decolonized, and they're also being sugar-coated, which is really, it's not enabling the students to receive the right amount of education that they deserve, especially students of color, during this incredibly, crazy uproar that critical race theory has around that actual point.
Absolutely. And just to wrap it up here, and I think we can all agree that in today's American democracy, education reform can be a long way around to navigate. But at the end of the day, the American people can especially see what loopholes remain on on America's education system, and what needs to be done from here on, as those unfulfilled promises continue to roll around America's minds. And not sure how much more time do we have, but I want to thank all the panelists here today for their time. We greatly appreciate hearing your perspectives across the country. And now I would like to pass it on to Sixto for him to move forward with the next topic. Sixto.
All right, moving on to the next topic. I say, we're joined by Anya from Los Angeles, California, Kayla from Philadelphia, and Mohammed from Washington State, and Isabel from Washington, D.C. to talk about community safety and justice. I think that many of us, we were part of a watch party with so many. As they come on, I'll just share that, many of us around the country, activists around the country, were watching together on a Zoom. And I think when the President Biden turned around and said the words, "We can't defund the police," I think there were reactions that went fire. So I am extremely excited to hear from folks about what are their thoughts, the pros, the things that may have not jived so much. And so I know, Bella, let's start off with you. And I know you also have some, words probably around education if you want to hit that too. But I want to start off with you about your initial reactions.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm a gun violence prevention activist. I work for March for Our Lives as a policy associate, and I'm on the Teaming Up Executive Council. And definitely what you just said, Sixto, I think, initially the president tried to talk about community violence intervention programs, which is a crucial and brilliant step in creating safer communities. But this was just completely overshadowed by his negligence to listen to young people and survivors and advocates when we say that we don't need more police, that we don't say we need more investing in police. Instead, he suggested that increasing funding is the answer. And in order to end gun violence, we must confront the ways that law enforcement's brutal targeting of communities of color and Black people in particular contributes to gun deaths and injuries. And the president's strategies do not prevent violence, but they rather shift who is perpetrating it. I think in order to address gun violence and create safer communities, we have to make meaningful change by addressing root causes like poverty. And that is manifested in things like homelessness, food scarcity, and disparate access to healthcare. And these are all things I see here in my community in DC, right under the nose of the president and the Congress members who go to work here every day, a place where gun violence is really rampant. So I think it's truthfully very sad that that was his initial response and that we didn't see many traction on actual gun safety bills that could make a difference, like universal background checks and Ethan's Law. But mainly, I'm really infuriated because since the last State of the Union, there have been over 49,000 gun deaths and injuries in this country. And the urgency of this issue is so evident. And so I think that, it's so important. And gun violence prevention advocates and survivors have been advocating for him to declare a national emergency around gun violence and to appoint a national director of gun violence prevention. And so we can put these executive resources towards the issue to create these changes. So I was really disheartened just to not see that today at the State of the Union.
So, Bella, as we have people continue to join us here, I want to ask the direct question here. Was it not enough to talk about ghost guns, though? The president did address, one of the biggest loopholes around gun violence, and it's ghost people who have, guns that don't have a serial number, cannot be tracked, are given to folks who, should be banned. And so, was that just not enough, or what's your reaction to him mentioning ghost guns?
I think ghost guns is a victory, but gun violence is not a monolithic issue. There are so many things that go into it. We have to be addressing these root causes. We have to be doing these easy wins like universal background checks and safe storage. Ghost guns can go a long way if we have other Congress members who are supportive and trying to pass legislation. Then we're never going to see a true victory and a true response to end this epidemic.
Kayla, thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Kayla. Kayla, I want to hear from you. Tell me a little bit more about what was your initial reaction. The president had a lot to say about justice tonight, had a lot to say about community safety.
So my initial reaction was, there's several different forms of safety, right? We've got our physical safety, our biological safety, emotional safety, and economic safety. And so I saw a lot of focus on that physical safety, really focusing in on our physical bodily safety. I did not see a lot of focus on biological safety as a high risk and disabled person who has been surviving this pandemic. I was really disappointed to see that COVID was such a small aspect of safety in the conversation, and also the conversation around justice, right? So he mentioned the American Rescue Plan helping everyone and nobody being left out. And my immediate thought was, what about people with disability? What about students who were not eligible for all of the checks? What about students whose parents claimed them as dependents so they couldn't get those stimulus checks? So I really was thinking about economic safety, emotional safety, biological safety, and really trying to see how he was addressing those different areas. I think that there is no justice right now for a lot of us. And it was really frustrating that, as somebody who doesn't feel safe right now, taking their mask off to see a room with that many people, just really excited to be without masks. And also, it was a reminder to me as a disabled person that a lot of these accommodations the past 2 years are going to be disappearing. We're seeing remote jobs going away. we're seeing accommodations just going away because now most people are safe to be without a mask. And so that was what really hit me the most. Is I was really focusing in on, how can I feel safe when a pandemic is still ongoing, and there's a war going on? And I just felt like safety and justice were kind of like a blip that were added in, and not focused on enough. I also thought it was really frustrating bringing in the LGBT community in a very superficial way at the end of the address. Felt really stagnant and kind of gross.
Taylor, tell me a little bit more, because I actually had a different reaction, because I was like, the president actually said trans woman, and trans women have been dying at an alarming rate. They have been being killed. And so I just want to hear a little bit more about that perspective. And then I want to turn it over to Anya to give us your perspective right after that. So if we can get 30 seconds on the last thought there, then I'll switch, we'll go over to Anya.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do all of my work in the LGBT community. And while I do agree, it's really great to be hearing proper terminology, and I'm happy and excited. I think that is a very small part of the picture. And working within these communities in Philadelphia, New Jersey, Orlando, I've moved around. Um, Doing different pop-ups in different areas. I would say
Yes.
that representation is happening now, but still, he didn't mention the harm that was happening. He just said trans woman, right? And so then we have an association to that word, but did we really talk about LGBT issues? I don't think so.
Awesome. Thank you, Kayla, so much for your perspective here. I'm going to go over to Anya, and I would love to hear your initial reactions.
My initial reactions for most of the speech, he was definitely addressing the war and just some ideas around COVID and stuff. And then it shifted into affordability and justice for people that are being greatly affected by inflation, and, making more jobs and making healthcare more affordable and making housing more affordable. But then there was like no conversation behind the requirements to get said housing. And if you look in Los Angeles, like if you've ever seen Skid Row in your life, it's the most horrifying thing ever. Like it's absolutely like disheartening to like watch that. And like going to USC, being like very close to that and like seeing like homeless people everywhere. And it's not like there isn't housing, it's that they cannot get it. Even if it is, even if it does become quote unquote affordable, they are still made to be a part of the community that is like excluded from people that like this is available to. And then my reaction to the fund the police comment, which was very I was a little struck. I was like, that your entire campaign this past year and just getting in office has been about like justice and like reform and this and that, and like the amount of things that have been happening with like Black Lives Matter and the amount of Black people dying as a result of police violence against communities of color. And then to sit there and say, we need to fund the police, we need to put more guns in policemen's hands, we need to make it so that communities are feeling unsafe. Because the more you drive up police, just like the more that you drive up a police presence in a community, the more you are telling them, we do not trust you. And then putting so much focus on just like this very controlling like institution, which I have a lot to say about the police anyway, but like if you're putting so much of your funding into police, you are neglecting the fact that you aren't putting enough funding into the community and like giving those people resources so that they have better education and they have somewhere to go, like a community center or something. Like the amount of communities that don't have somewhere to go after school or when their parents aren't at home, or like just like it's the small things that aren't talked about and aren't, they're just very cared, like they're just cared very little for, that I think really needs to change. And right now, like funding the police is absolutely not the answer. Like we do not need more aggression. We do not need that.
I want to thank you here. I know what you call it. You all have shared some great perspectives here. We're going to move to our next panel. I want to thank you each. If Mohammed's able to get connected, we will. I'll say that I was happy to hear very key pillars addressed like ghost guns. Very happy to hear the commitment to trans lives and the president saying those words at the State of the Union, and I'm pretty shocked at some other points. So I'm going to pass it to Jeremy here, who's going to introduce our next panel.
Thanks, Sisto. Our next issue, and it's one of the most hot trending issues, not just happening in our country, but also happening at the global spectrum. It's one that is a cause of much anxiety for our future, climate and the environment. And with us to discuss this topic, joining us now is Brianna from Brunswick, Maine, Shiv from NYC, New York City, Matt from San Antonio, Texas, Gargi from Houston, Texas, and Anika from Houston, Texas. Welcome to all the panelists here tonight. I want to start with Brianna first. Now, as you have seen, in the past first year, of the Biden administration, we have continued to see, the mobilization of young people, especially when it comes to, vulnerable communities, demanding the Biden administration, to get its hands on deck when it comes to, righting the wrongs, of what the past, of what young people had endured, in the past 4 years. Now, I will note that the first thing that we ever witnessed the Biden administration to do was to return the United States to the Paris Climate Accord. And following up, almost a year later, we have seen this. We have seen the position of the United States being in the midst of a problematic tumble where when his administration is approving new oil and gas leases, while at the same time being at COP26 demanding and imploring to the world that the United States is back. So I want to start off with what were your thoughts on that, and what more could President Biden have said in the State of the Union to make the case that climate change is still the core issue?
Yeah, Jeremy, I think you identify a really, really key contradiction. There has been altogether too much compromise on the part of the Biden administration, and the actions they have come up with have, simply put, been inadequate. According to the IPCC report that was just released recently, the window for action to avert utter catastrophe is rapidly closing. And one thing I'll say that's absolutely critical in response to current events is that we cannot allow fossil fuel companies to exploit the current crisis and the horrors of Russia's war on Ukraine for their own profit. They're already attempting to use this moment to exploit the fears of ordinary working Americans about gas prices and use fear-mongering about energy independence to push for new drilling and the release of strategic reserves. It's unacceptable, and it would be further climate disaster. We do need energy independence, but real energy independence means clean energy, as well as environmental justice. And so I was really disappointed not to see the Biden administration lay out a roadmap towards that.
And Shiv, I want to lead on to you because since November, when the bipartisan infrastructure bill was passed and signed into law, we have quite noticed the catchphrase that it was going to be a 10-year period for the law to be come into effect, while we are still dealing with natural disasters, like winter storms, or with power outages, happening across the country. So I wanted to hear just your thoughts again on what on what President Biden has ever, talked about, with respects to climate reform. And, where do you think, the groundwork for environmental activists and other interest groups involved, should be heading next, up in the upcoming midterms?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jeremy. And yeah, I think when we're talking about the climate crisis as a whole, this is a topic, to be very clear, that President Biden very aggressively campaigned on during his presidential campaign. And it was one of the main issues that young people really care about. And that's the pitch that he made to young voters, that if you elect me as president, we'll fight the climate crisis. But it was pretty much absent in his entire State of the Union speech. We got a few mentions here and there of climate policies, but President Biden tonight did not present a clear, coherent agenda for solving the climate crisis that will, one, meet the scale of the action needed, and two, protect communities that are most vulnerable. In terms of some of the positives that he did mention regarding that's something that could work for the midterm elections, he talked about electric vehicle stations, energy credits, some programs around home weatherization. These are three solid programs. However, they're not going to be tackling the larger issues at hand. What he completely missed tonight was how we're going to be tackling emissions, what regulations we need to actually get there, how, what Brianna said, reaching energy independence, and what is actually a pathway to create good green jobs. The way that we win in the midterms and the way that President Biden can actually really create a really solid agenda is by doing something that we did right here in New York City. We looked at what New York City's emissions, where they largely came from, and an ordinance was passed, Local Law 97, which directly addresses building emissions. Over 75% of New York City's emissions come from buildings. We were able to look at the issue, create policy to change it, but Biden has not done that. And he is continuing to fail voters. And as young people, I'm working with young people constantly every day, and all I'm hearing is that if he's not going to take the action that's needed, who knows what's going to happen for the midterms, and it's only going to be bad for that, but it's also spelling bad future for what our energy future looks like, what our climate looks like, and how we move going forward.
Shiv, I want to follow up and ask a question to you and the panel here. Now, we did not hear a lot about Build Back Better, and I was waiting for it. And in the Build Back Better plan, what we know is that at least in that plan, there was over $500 billion that was supposed to be also part of the investment into climate change. Now, is it the actual administration, or is it that Congress is so deadlocked that even in his State of the Union address, it seemed that we did not go, and there was a lot of energy that I felt like the administration put behind to go ahead and create a bipartisan energy. So is it Congress or is it the administration? I would love to hear your thoughts.
It's President Biden. President Biden is the president of the United States. This falls flatly on his feet. He has the power, he has the political capital to actually put something behind it. Build Back Better has a lot of climate initiatives that would actually fundamentally transform a lot of how our country is run in terms of climate and in terms of some of the solutions that we need. If President Biden isn't willing to actually use his political capital to make it happen, it is Congress's fault as well, but President Biden needs to be actually making this aggressive action, needs to be lobbying people, needs to be corralling votes to move it forward. But without him, it's dead.
Thank you so much. I want to hear from the other panelists too, but I had to ask a question because I do feel like Congress does have a responsibility in this. Congress has been holding up things, and we need to hold them just as accountable as the other players in this too. But that's just my opinion. I'm here to hear other folks' opinions too, so I'll pass it back to you, Jeremy. I had to jump in there.
Absolutely, no worries, Sixto, and thank you again for spreading us that reminder that we have to, maintain accountability efforts up in place, as we head into the midterms and as we head into what expectation needs to happen next. Matt Bice, I want to turn to you. So just recently, the United Nations Climate Report was not at all surprising during the aftermath of COP26, because it continues to make the case to the rest of the world that for years now, the last minute window for reversing back some of those anti-climate initiatives that wealthy nations have done cannot be possible to go back and fix the socioeconomical damages again. But what are you hoping to see now, from here onto the midterms, as to where President Biden can land a victory, even a small victory, when it comes to climate reform?
I appreciate that question. And I think it's important to say, right, that leadership on climate action at the global level means leadership on climate action in the United States and in our own country. So to take it into a little perspective, in just the past year, we have seen climate catastrophes across our country, from devastating tornadoes and wildfires to, like my home state, with the Texas freeze, where hundreds of Texans tragically died while hundreds of thousands sat at home without power, just like my family did, staying huddled at home for days without power. And so on the day of the Texas primary, mind you, I was disappointed in two things with President Biden. First off, he didn't talk about the more urgent need to take climate action, given the devastating impact that climate change has had on my home state and on many other states. For instance, we have energy prices that are rising for the average Texan because of last year's winter catastrophe. And President Biden, I think, really needs to take further steps to protect the everyday family from those rising energy costs, increase green energy sources, and also create resilient infrastructure. On the second piece, I was also disappointed that we didn't hear from President Biden about how the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which he did talk about, but how it will start correcting our nation's history of environmental racism, right? By replacing lead pipes, for example, and fixing crumbling infrastructure in Black and Brown communities. So we know that climate action is popular, it's effective, and it will protect our future. And ultimately, I think, President Biden is on the right track on many of his climate policies. And I believe the administration wants to maybe take some real tangible steps towards a green energy sector and a green economy. But I also believe that he has to lead on prioritizing environmental justice, as well as putting those frontline communities at the top of the list for federal investments in climate resilience. And they also, to the point that I think all of my peers have made here, actually talk about doing this.
That's right, absolutely. And Gargi, I want to turn down to you. Inflation has been touted around, in several presidential cabinet meetings, thousands of times, especially when, you are talking to, CEOs, trying to plead them, to not involve themselves in price gouging or exploiting, oil and gas prices, to American consumers. But it all comes down to show that, we still cannot, as a country, right, abandon, fossil fuels, as scientists have proclaimed, it has already been long overdue, to transition into a green energy sector, as Matt has, previously mentioned before. So I wanted to hear again your thoughts as to, what should young voters be looking out for President Biden to do, up to the midterms, especially when it comes to, approaching this idea of, maintaining a, equitable climate for everybody, even if it's not as perfect as one might think.
Right. I think that we definitely did see a lot of those contradictions that you were mentioning about, like, him talking about corporations and inflation, and then also trying to, in a very, I guess, subtle way, advocate for the climate. So I think that what young voters should really be looking for right now is Biden actually implementing or talking about how he's going to implement climate strategies, because as like a lot of other of the panelists have said, he really did not do this at all in the State of the Union address. And I feel like that's just so crucial right now, is to at least talk about it. Like, I did not hear the word IPCC report at all, even though this was such a big report and it just came out. And I think that that's what young people should be looking for. It's Biden actually implementing these promises that he campaigned so heavily for. All he really did in this address is throw around a couple of buzzwords around the climate. And this was honestly, as a young person, really disappointing to see. And I think that if we want to win back, or if we want to win majority in these midterm elections, we need to be actually talking about how implementation is going to work, because we've seen so many empty promises throughout so many different like leaderships, not only just Biden. I just think it's the most disappointing that Biden campaigned so heavily on it. It feels almost like exploitative at this point, and we cannot continue to keep like I do think the economy is incredibly important, but we can't keep prioritizing money and profit and keeping corporations happy if that means that we're literally on the path towards a deadly future.
And Anika, you have the last pitch here. From ever since the winter storm that just happened in Texas, you can tie that along with the tornado that struck down most of Kentucky. Um, you know, Natural disasters continue to happen. Out of humanity's control. It seems that is the rhetoric flowing around the Biden White House. And not exactly what climate advocates have been expecting President Biden to closely pay attention as to what are some of the systemic loopholes of the federal government that should be tackling these domestic issues. So is it fair to say that from here on that climate change as a whole continues to be the dominant threat to our American democracy in ways that not only keeps us from engaging and solving this problem altogether, but also coming into terms as to how we should balance our priorities going forward as Americans.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much. Well, I definitely think climate change is a priority going forward. I mean, it's long overdue at this point, and that's why I think it's such like a slap in the face to not even like hear Biden mention climate change that much. In fact, I just like quickly looked up like the transcript of his speech, and the word climate was mentioned twice, and that already shows that we're not focusing on this huge issue that impacts us on so many different levels. As you mentioned, in my home community of Houston, we just dealt with Winter Storm Uri in 2021, and there's countless natural disasters that we've experienced, and this is something that's replicated across the world, and that's not something that we're seeing like tangible action again to address. And again, it's coming at a time where we've just seen President Biden make a lot of promises at COP26, the IPCC report yesterday that really is just showing that the dangers of climate change are mounting so rapidly. And even beyond that, going back in time when we think of President Biden's campaign and considering the fact that he had promised almost like a climate administration to really funnel all these resources to solving this issue or taking these tangible steps to getting towards meaningful progress. And we're not really seeing that happen at all. In fact, President Biden was incredibly vague with his promises surrounding clean energy. He hasn't really like mentioned, again, more of like the steps that are going to be taken in addition to like congressional support and legislation that can back these steps to reaching a green energy sector and things like that, and also prioritizing green energy and clean energy over the fossil fuel industry. And furthermore, one thing that really frustrated me was really not hearing anything about frontline communities and indigenous communities and the communities that are impacted the most by climate change. Just seeing that whole gap in his address it's just like really jarring, and it goes to show just how I guess just like incredibly insensitive it is to these communities that President Biden failed to address this issue.
So I have to say, before we wrap up, I want to be able to ask the question: are we truly being fair, though? I think we got like 45 seconds for one more reaction. I think when we did talk, we have seen that the Biden administration did actually establish an office on climate change, and there are people who are assigned to that. We did see commitments to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030. And yet I do hear you that we haven't heard folks, certain folks be lifted up in terms of equity being such a strong part of their what you call it. But it was the last administration that deregulated so much. It was the last administration that fired actual scientists on staff. So how much of this can we actually say it's on Biden? And so I want to ask the question to one of you to give a 45-second reflection of like, is it truly fair to be like, this is this administration's fault, we missed the window because of this administration, or is it much more complicated?
I can go if I don't know. Okay. But I mean, I just really quickly want to say I think that we can 100% put at least like some of the blame on Biden because I mean, he has been in office for like what, 2 years now, year and a half, one year. Yeah.
In a couple months, right?
Yeah, I feel like that is enough time to at least start making these changes, which we really haven't seen. Like, we just keep seeing these empty promises. Like, 1 year is a good amount of time to start implementation, but we simply don't see that. So, yeah, we can go ahead and blame Biden for a lot of what's still happening.
Absolutely. And thank you, Sixto, for, reminding us, one more time that, there is some ambiguity that we have to really point out as far as where, the future of President Biden's climate agenda is heading next. And with that being said, I want to thank all the panelists for joining us here tonight. And now we're going to transition to the next policy topic that is going to ring everybody's ears, especially at this current state of crises. Sixto, I turn it back to you.
All righty. So the next topic is on jobs in our future. So we're gonna get into this today. We're gonna have Grace from Chicago, Illinois, Kennedy from New York City, Priya from San Francisco, California, and Dewey from Washington, D.C. I am just so honored that so many advocates, young people from all over the country have been joining us tonight to give their initial reactions. And as we go into this, we're going to start pushing back a little and we're going to start spicing up the conversation a bit more to really start creating a dialogue of like what we heard that may have not resonated and what did resonate. And let's actually like start dialoguing into that. And so I want to kick it off with Priya, if you don't mind me making you first. Tell me your reaction. There was a lot in this speech about jobs tonight. And so tell me a little bit more about what was some of your initial reactions.
Yeah, thank you, Sixto. I think one thing that stood out to me is I was glad to see Biden make mention of increasing the digital divide and making sure that everyone has access to high-speed internet. That's, become an increasingly important issue. But one of my questions is who is providing this access and who is building out this digital infrastructure? Because we don't want to see more of us dependent on these private corporations. And, speaking of those corporations, Biden gave a lot of praise to Intel for creating American jobs. And it's like, well, who are those jobs going to? And how do we make sure that we hold these companies accountable and that they don't continue to surveil and disrupt vulnerable communities while they are creating these jobs?
Priya, I just so appreciate that. I think that what we saw in the recovery from 2008's financial crisis is that when jobs did come back, that jobs didn't come back for the folks who were in experiencing low income and medium incomes. What we saw were job creations were in different parts of the sector. And we need those jobs to grow there too. And asking that question, especially with the infrastructure bill, especially with the opportunity for retraining and tooling up, like we should be intentional about creating that. So thank you for that, Priya. I'm going to switch over to Dewey. Dewey, talk to me.
No, thank you, Sixto. And just really glad to be here with you all. I think, to build on that point about the recovery and about jobs going to young people, especially young people who haven't had the opportunities, young people of color, Black, Indigenous, and other young people of color, especially who haven't had opportunities, who have historically excluded. And, it's very clear, too, that we're still in a pandemic, even though, it's as much as we tried to get out of it. The recovery still hasn't been equitable. And it's although Biden talked a lot about job creation, we haven't seen any real targeted investments in creating jobs specifically for young people. And, you brought this up earlier, Sixto, about Build Back Better. And I really would, it's almost like he kind of forgot that Build Back Better was his whole central policy agenda. And I do recognize how difficult that was to get through, but I really would like, and I know Sixto, you and I worked on that bill. We have so many good friends, so many of our good friends in the administration who are working so hard on really great policy solutions like Build Back Better that would create jobs for young people, that would do so much, I think, that we're all wanting, but to kind of abandon it like he did, I think that's sort of a miss. I'd love to see him go back to that. We were able to see how Congress really came together, the country came together to send weapons to Ukraine, billions of dollars. But I think we kind of need to bring that same energy into that and bringing that investment into Build Back Better into our own economy here. Yeah, Sixto, what were you gonna say?
I was gonna say, Dewey, I gotta push on this, because is it that the administration is abandoning it, or is it that Senator Manchin and others have held it? And is there a way? Do they see a possible way to unblocking, or is this the moment where we say Build Back Better died because it was not mentioned?
No, I don't think
the vision going
that,
forward?
but I don't think by not talking about it, it sounds like he's moved on from. To me, it sounded like he moved on to Build Back Better. He's talking about the bipartisan infrastructure deal. He's talking about the a different set of bills that are bipartisan that I feel like I can't remember exactly what he said, but it sounds like to me he hasn't, there's, and maybe, I don't think, it doesn't sound like this year it's going to be back up and running, but maybe after the midterms, but we'll see what happens with the rest of it. But the last thing I wanted to say also, and just like as a member of the Coalition Youth and Gov, it's also really important that the government just doesn't create quality employment, but that young people are in positions of power within the government as well, because I think that's when we'll really see some of these transformative changes. We do know there are young people that are really great allies in the administration that we really can work with, but there's just not enough. We're not represented. The Youth and Gov Coalition has a lot of demands, but really wants to see us being reflected in positions of power. So I think that's another area where I think the administration could really support us.
Thank you, Joe. I'm gonna pop over to Grace. Grace, talk to me.
Yeah, I'll talk to you. I'll start with my criticism, and then I'll try to think of some of the pluses. But a lot of what I was thinking in that call is, yes, the economy recovered, but at what cost? And that's really stark for me. We're nearly at 1 million dead from COVID-19 under an economic model of bring everyone back to work without really assessing the full risks. Early in COVID, we were like, we love our frontline workers, we love our healthcare workers, we love our people that are essential workers. But largely this pandemic, we've discarded them. We've seen them die at exceptionally high rates, and largely a lot of those people are Black and brown people that have been at the front lines. And I think we just have to think about who does the economy work for? And I'm glad that Biden is emphasizing going after these billionaires that hold these big companies and that have been profiting massively off of this kind of COVID-19 pandemic. And also thinking about the power of unions. And the PRO Act is just the start. I mean, anyone in this country should be able to form a union. And more so, workers are the driving heart of our economy, but often are not able to control the decisions made on the shop floor. So maybe we bring the jobs back in manufacturing, but are they actually going to be good jobs, and are they going to survive? Because we realize that the costs are higher to maintain these workers, and it's very easy for these jobs to just easily move back overseas. So I think for me, I really think about, how are we investing in people so that this is longevity and this is lifelines, and not just, we have jobs out there, but are they good jobs? Are they sustaining jobs? Do they pay enough to live in these big cities? If we're going to return people back to cities and go back to work, people are not going to be able to afford them on the wages that they have. And I think speaking specifically to young people, I wish we could talk more about the jobs that young people want and need. We have emerged these immense crises, from climate change to our health system, and where are young people in this conversation, as we've witnessed, what we've been promised, fall apart. How are we supposed to plan for our futures if we don't have the jobs and capacity and power necessary to organize? It's what I'm thinking. It's what I'm feeling. So Definitely.
Grace, thank you for that. You know, it was very interesting to me that I heard him talk about the Rust Belt and I heard him talk about investments in Ohio, 20 miles outside of an urban place. And I couldn't help but think to myself that I know the Build Back Better plan, there was a commitment to building 2 million apartments because what we know that folks who are experiencing low and medium income need more apartments and that the demand has been driving up housing costs. But it seems to me almost in this speech, is the administration trying to give us a glimpse that they're talking about investing in rural and suburban America as a counteract to it? I don't know. I don't know if that's the plan, but there seemed to me a little bit of a vibe there that I don't know how far the Build Back Better plan is going to continue to be pushed. But I'm going to go over to you, Kennedy. I want to hear your initial reactions. What were some of the things that resonated with you? What were some of the things that you were like, man, I wish I would have heard?
Yeah, so I think something that I noticed right at the end is that, Biden briefly mentioned that we should hold social media companies accountable for the ways that they connect their personal data and how it affects our children. And on the screen, actually, we saw Frances Haugen, the woman known for being the whistleblower in the Facebook case about their data collection practices. And so my first observation was that Biden said nothing about how the government was actually going to hold these tech companies accountable, which is really frustrating. He literally just brought it up as like a buzz term. They showed Haugen, and that was it. He moved on. And we know that the government certainly does not know what's going on with technology. And an example of this was the general confusion and lack of knowledge of government officials during that congressional hearing around the Facebook case in October of last year. And so the bottom line to me, I think that tech companies should not be allowed to govern themselves with sensitive data that has contributed to the realm of algorithmic bias and injustice, and also the over monetization of our society through the accumulation of this big data that Biden was kind of touching on. But also, what needs to happen, I think, is one, there has to be some sort of government agency dedicated to the understanding of big data and tech and how it impacts our society. And it should be filled with technology experts, cognitive and behavioral scientists, leaders in ethics, etc. The government has to actually be informed if it is going to intervene in the decisions on how we're going to let big data affect our society. And then once that's established, they also need to fund future research on the trajectory of technology and how it will affect our society. Because we need to be able to educate citizens and other corporations on how to navigate this future that's really going to be driven by data and technology. It's really going to change our day-to-day lives, how our jobs are done, how we make money, and etc. And then I think that my third suggestion, like inspired by Biden's emphasis on like creating jobs and like manufacturing and technology by large companies like Intel, is to actually provide incentives and funding for more people to actually become educated enough or receive degrees in technology and engineering. Like, how can these jobs actually be useful for people if there's like educational and financial barriers to securing these positions? And this incentive should also be paired by engineering curriculum in our schools for, high schoolers and middle schoolers, because you really do not see a lot of this education in our public education systems.
I want to thank you so much for that. I think, one of the things I would note is that even the presence still of some of the folks I felt was a statement, because there was still social distancing going on within that chamber. And so who was sitting in the room, I felt were symbolic moments. And then to have certain individuals who do represent data protection, I kind of felt like that was a statement from the administration. But I do hear folks clearly and loud saying like, maybe that wasn't enough. Maybe we need to have more actual dedicated words to it. But I have to say that when it comes down to who was in the room, I felt like, look, it was a bold move to say, I'm going to have someone in here who's about the data protection of folks in the room. And I also want to point out one of the curious things, that there was a moment in his speech where he talked about wages. Now, we didn't talk about minimum wage, but he talked about, and I felt like this was a message to the corporations, do not decrease people's wages. in order to keep, those profit margins going. But talking about if we collectively bring jobs here and manufacturing here in the US, can we bring down the cost of what it takes to produce product? And interesting thought. I think it's an interesting thought. I would love to see a little bit more of the math on it, as I know salaries tend to be one of the biggest costs in a lot of different corporations and companies. But any final thoughts before we go? And I'll pass it, actually, Jeremy. Jeremy, I'll end with you. But if anyone has the last 45 seconds, let's do it. And
Yeah,
I
I think
time, yeah.
I wanted to add to wages, not just wages, it's the benefits. I think briefly, I was glad that Biden mentioned how women and mothers have been pushed out of the workforce because they can't afford childcare. We need to be able to have these benefits of childcare, paid leave, health insurance, things that actually sustain people beyond just making the bare minimum. And I think we need to think about jobs as encompassing the full person, as we've seen during COVID-19. When one thing fails, everything capsizes along with it. And so I just wanted to add that. I was glad it was brought up, but definitely think it's not just a livable wage, it's also the money to then be able to go beyond, get those beautiful tech jobs, advance our society. That's not possible without a sustaining as a human being in a holistic way.
Well, I want to thank you all, panelists. I want to thank you for such a great conversation, being able to push back and bringing diverse thinking to this. And Jeremy, I'm going to pass it to you for some final words as we bring on the next panel and you introduce the next panel.
And thank you, Sixto. You're really killing it out here. So appreciate you.
No problem, Joey. Thank you. And I'll say that one correction. I just said that the president didn't mention the federal minimum wage, and I believe that I'm not correct on that, that there was a mention and I missed that. So just want to live self-correct there. Jeremy, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you, Sixto. And yes, wages was touted around various times, as we continue to see. And before we move on to the next panel, I did wanted to again reiterate, the current events that were happening outside, the Biden administration's efforts, to prioritize American workers, through his Build Back Better agenda. We have seen that labor unions have gotten the spotlight last year, for breaking barriers with corporations and gaining the final victory to organize and unionize, as you can see through Amazon, labor unions down in Tennessee, and with Arizona Starbucks. Labor unions have gotten the spotlight, for many Gen Z workers. Such a fun fact. But it all comes into a response that American workers did not feel as prioritized as they thought they would, back when President Biden jumped into office. And thank you, Sixto, again for leading this panel. And now moving on to the next panel and our final panel, for tonight. We will be discussing about mental health and well-being in America. And for our final State of the Union response, we have the following panelists. Inari is from Springfield, Massachusetts, Ramya from Chicago, Illinois, and Sedona from Denver, Colorado. So thank you all for being here tonight at the last minute, as this is our final panel, of the night. Now, what I do want to start off this discussion is basically revolving around, the role of mental health playing in, in millennials and in Gen Z in general. Now, for millennials, the one thing that has been, been impacting their mental health the most was the search for homes. As the housing market, has been, keeping these, millennials very stressful and nervous to find a home for themselves and being able to afford, something that they can work for in America. But but what really mental health entails right now, as we saw throughout the pandemic, with respects to students is the amount of learning loss that you know that some students have experienced, while being in a remote environment and not being able to attend in-person classes, while the schools were on lockdown. So I wanted to, first focus on that state, on that realm of public health. And I want to start off with Inari here. Irani, we have witnessed, young people across this country, you know, navigating through the lack of mental health resources, not just within our schools, but also within other organizations, that we clearly missed it out. For example, we saw the rate of homicide rates increase by a small percentage, but it was increasing rapidly. We also saw, rates of depression and loneliness, and this underappreciated feeling that we all want the pandemic to be over. So, in your from your perspective, was there anything President Biden, you know, ever made the case about, how Americans were feeling right now with respects to, their mental health, and what should President Biden take into account from now, as mental health remains to be the top core issue of our lives?
Yeah, absolutely. I thought it was interesting the way he addressed the mental health issue. It was definitely, he definitely jam packed a couple things in the very last minutes there, so it was hard to like figure out what he was trying to convey. But he did seem to really make a correlation between that social media bit that was talked a lot about on the past panel and mental health, and I think that was an important connection to make. But there seems to be he did a lot of like the straddling, trying not to make too strong of a point, which is of course the norm in these kind of address and the State of the Union address. But there was a particular message that he seemed to have where he was urging us all to get back to work, get back to school, get back into the norm, but then also we're still in a pandemic, and just that kind of that struggle and that strain, which is hard to navigate, especially as a student myself. But that was hard for me to understand what his goal was there, because all of us, adults going back to work and trying to get back into that norm, and students going back to school after missing so much critical time of learning, it's really hard to make that adjustment, and it didn't, I don't think he conveyed that very well, because he seemed to have more of a focus and a stress on like getting how important it is to get back into the norm and get back to work. So I felt like he really missed that connection with the mental health crisis that's happening right now.
And Rania, let me jump in to you next. As we continue to discuss on the mental health effects of students, in general, as they have been, out of school, out of physical instruction for more than a year now, and as we are already returning back to the classrooms, as we're returning back to work, we have seen some institutions implement the hybrid model that will best fit the needs of the student, or any other person that is willing to return back to their original business pre-COVID. But what has been driving the mind of young Americans these days, when it comes to simply just not just getting over with the pandemic, but at the same time having some room for improvement, in terms of what more can be done, with respects to how governments should address mental health. And a follow up to that question, is it fair to say that our mental health resources are underfunded, and if so, should they prioritize it at this time?
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah. So in terms of when we talk about mental health, access to programs, and also mental health in general within the United States, it often goes overlooked or underlooked because we focus so much on the medical aspect of it rather than the the internal aspect of it, where it's the psychological. Sometimes the symptoms are not easily expressed than medical symptoms are often treated. So, in terms of when we talk about mental health within the United States, having access to these programs and having these programs be funded within underserved communities is definitely a big portion of what's something we have to look at within the field of public health, but then also in general within the United States. Often throughout the address, Biden mentioned that he wanted to invest, or the sort of idea of shared investing within America's future. And that starts with investing in education, investing in mental health programs, providing access to these programs to young people, and making sure that they have the resources available to them and that they're able to actively and effectively use those resources to achieve a more positive outcome in their lives. So when we talk about mental health within the United States, there have been a lot of past legislation that has been brought up now recently. Luckily, within recent years, there has been. I know the Surgeon General mentioned for his Youth Action Plan for Mental Health, and that's a wonderful step in the right direction because mental health within the United States is something that should be taken care of, taken looked at, but also a priority amongst government officials and amongst the American people in general, because there are a variety of factors that affect one's health, but taking a look at both factors and taking a look at the external and the internal, plus the implicit and explicit factors, is something that definitely should be looked at. And often throughout the pandemic that we've been looking at and that we've been seeing is that having access to those programs or having access in general to healthcare has been beneficial to a lot of communities and a lot of individuals. When we see those, those COVID vaccination sites and seeing those people getting tested in their local community organizations, or having that sort of flexibility when it comes to schooling in the educational institutions for those kids, obviously transitioning from online to in person is very difficult and can pose some challenges for young people. But just encouraging them to stay calm, stay patient during this time, and also encourage them to find different activities that sort of engage their positive aspects and find different ways that can affect their mental health in a positive light, and find those activities that can ultimately benefit them in the long run. So we're seeing that sort of shift within that schooling system. And then also, I think you mentioned about, offering these programs to young people and what the sort of state of mental health is within the United States. Obviously, we're still in a pandemic, and still there's a long way to go when we talk about going back to in person or having that hybrid model. But I think encouraging young people to have access to those mental health resources and also to be within their community and serve other people within their community can also pose a great deal of satisfaction, but then also a great deal of impact in helping other people around them and seeing that sort of positive impact that they're able to make through actions and supporting other people with that might be struggling within their community. Yeah.
And Sedona, you have the last word here. Since day one of the Biden administration, we were still dealing with the everlasting growing of cases, hospitalizations, and deaths of the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, we were able to get at least 65% of Americans vaccinated with at least one dose, and probably less than probably around 55% of Americans that are fully vaccinated. But what we have seen, since the last administration's, public health response, we have seen that, it's been very polarized and has been trickling down, several avenues of disinformation that it desperately impacted not just vulnerable communities, but also the immunocompromised, who are literally looking for a safe direction for, not only keeping their health safe, but at the same time being able to now adapt into a world that has already been overdriven by this virus. And if you were to take a look at how President Biden started his State of the Union speech, he went on, the environment, sort of explained how we have moved past the Omicron variant surge, and a lot of people maskless, but the one vulnerable group that we haven't seen, had that confidence in getting back to the new normal was people with disabilities. So, how do you? What would you like to hear from President Biden now on? As far as not just getting Americans return to this new normal, but at the same time making sure that all vulnerable communities, especially the disabled and the immunocompromised, do not get left out of this transition to an endemic phase.
Yeah, well, thank you. First of all, I just want to shout out all of the young leaders who have been here tonight. Like, your presence and your perspectives are truly inspiring. And I feel like that's what's going to bring us the change that we need to see in our world. So shout out to all of our young leaders. Shout out to you two amazing hosts right here, for leading us through this journey together. But let's talk about that term, that you keep using. And that is, I feel like, such a popular term right now, within politics and within our society, is this idea of a new normal, and I want to address that because to me there's this beautiful quote by Adrienne Marie Brown, and she says, our radical imagination is a tool for decolonization, for reclaiming our right to shape our lived reality. And I feel like that's what we need to do. And I feel like spaces like this, where young people can freely speak our mind and be open, is what's going to lead us in that direction of shaping our new lived reality and really tapping into this radical imagination, which I feel like is so powerful in youth, because we're still at that point where we have so much potential and possibility. So how can we really, tap into that? And when we're talking about mental health and the pandemic, we ain't even have time to grieve. We haven't had time to sit and think about all of the death and the suffering and just the impact that this pandemic has had, and that the climate crisis continues to have on our world. When I think about the state of the planet, it brings me so much grief. And it's hard in our, capitalist society to even find time to express that, to, hold ceremony where we can, really come together and connect authentically. Our society is so tied up in technology and profit margins that we often miss this essential connection to each other, to the earth. I think that is so critical right now. And a big reason I feel like so many young people and just people in general are depressed is because, like, our mother earth is suffering. She is dying. She's crying out for us to stop polluting and stop extracting her for profit. And so I feel like, bringing us back to the climate crisis conversation, I feel like that really was not talked about enough. And when, Biden did barely bring up mental health, he didn't talk about the trauma that contributes to mental health. He didn't talk about the disconnection in our communities and how young people are impacted by not, being able to be in school. And then on the flip side of that, some young people don't even feel safe in schools. So I feel like a lot of these conversations and a lot of these topics we're viewing very like surface level and very one-dimensionally, when we really should be looking at the intersectionalities of all of this. And so many of the amazing like comments by all of of my youth peers here tonight, I feel like really highlighted the intersectionalities. And it's like, that's why we need these conversations, because we need to be making these connections and thinking more holistically about the solutions to our planet right now. You know, when we think about the war, like I have a little baby girl right now, I'm a new mother, and it brings me so much anxiety to think about, you know, more war and the threat of nuclear war and what that would do to the ecosystems, and how that affects our current and future generations of children and of young people. So I feel like we need to have these critical conversations. We need to bring back healing circles. We need to, you know, have rites of passage so we can, you know, just feel this true connection again. And I feel like that's what's gonna bring us true healing, and a real mental health and well-being. So, you know, shout out to Adrienne Marie Brown for, you know, her quote and helping us tap into that radical imagination. And one more quick thing about mental health as well is, you know, our young mothers out there, you know, there is, you know, it's serious thinking about that postpartum depression and, you know, what moms are going through in this society. I feel like we really need to bring back the support, you know, for new mothers, and for, you know, all the babies, the future ancestors coming into this world. How could we foster more support, more connection, and more community for those who truly need it? And so, you know, I really think that does revolve around environmental justice, you know, the land back movement, and really prioritizing the climate crisis and true healing. So, you know, that's my thoughts. And I definitely want to shout out all of the young people on this call. I also want to shout out the young people that I work with in Denver. The IFER Prevention Youth Leadership Team focuses on substance abuse prevention and also views substance abuse as a form of, you know, mental health. And we really want to look at these things through a trauma-informed lens, where we're uplifting, you know, racial equity and social and environmental justice, and really bringing in these intersectionalities. So yeah, so much love to all of you. And I truly believe we are going to bring forth this change. And as Cesar Chavez says, once social change begins, it cannot be reversed. You cannot uneducate the person who has learned to read. And so, you know, I want to shout out everybody on here for bringing that change, and sharing your voices and sharing your truth. So much love from me and my little star seed over here, the future generation.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing us that perspective. And Sixto, I want you to help me wrap up this panel by having you introduce the your final words on, you know, mental health. I mean, you have been a child welfare advocate, you know, and just want to hear your thoughts again. Now, throughout your work, you know, on child welfare, we have seen various factors, you know, of the Build Back Better agenda that, you know, in a sense, you know, in a sense, tackles and highlights, you know, the role of mental health, such as childcare, such as, you know, substance drug use prevention. So, what do you see this going forward?
You know, I was happy to hear the president talk about, you know, one of his what he referred to the unity agenda. And although I would want to wave a magic wand and see a couple things on there, the first thing he did mention was the opioid crisis. And so for so many young people in this country, that is part of the reason why they are in foster care, right? Drug addiction has been one of the reasons why children end up in the foster care system. So I was happy to hear it. But what I would love to see is that, you know, folks have the ability to actually get resource, that folks have the ability to be able to innovate. What are the different type of interventions? We heard loud and clear, there's a tackle on prescription drugs and the prices that are related to that. So that's a plus, right? I do think that right now, most of our children who are in child welfare who need support around mental health, like, could benefit from alternatives to the traditional kind of talk therapy. There are facilities that are being used, and when facilities are used without a purpose, it's not good for young people. And yet what we need is a much more innovation around in-home services. And so what I would love to see is the investment in the interventions, that new potential interventions, and not just saying, hey, let's give money to evidence-based programs, because I believe that we have a long ways to go to find out what are the supports that children and families need when they are going through their mental well-being journey. So I can go on and on and on with that, but I know we're coming to an end here. I'm gonna pass it to you and then I'll close it out. But I do believe that, this was a step in that direction, but I think that we really need the private sector, nonprofit sector, to be able to go ahead and start taking, the science that we do now know, the new science that we now know, and figure out what are these newer type of interventions to actually support people's mental health. And I will congratulate the administration on a very concrete that they did, which is back in December, right? They issued, the Surgeon General issued an advisory around youth mental health. It is the strongest tool that the federal government has, the Surgeon General has in his toolbox. And so to issue that and then to say it here at the State of the Union, it is powerful. And people should take that as a call of action to take action.
Absolutely. And thank you, Sixto, for giving us that last speech here. And that is a wrap of our Young People Address the Nation event. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight for our second Young People Address the Nation event. As I've already said, we hope you could resonate with some of the points made tonight, and we hope that you appreciate, every young person who came into this event, who participated in these panels, to put their perspectives in the spotlight, with respects to what future expectations can we continue to set, as we are as we are helping moving our country forward. And we would like to thank our 45 partners for helping to make tonight happen and for their commitment to amplify youth voices. And to learn more about our partners, check them out on youngpeopleaddress.org.
So as we close out this event, I'll say that I have a feeling that tomorrow America's going to wake up and that no one's going to be happy. And I have to commend the president and the administration for taking that move. What we have seen over the last year has been a lot of partisanship. And tonight's speech represents a moment where I saw balances of the views of America. Some of the things I was cheering, some of the things I wanted to just keep sitting in my seat. And that is what America is about. And so I commend the administration and the president for being bold enough to be inclusive of the ideologies of the American people. And that means both sides. And then we heard things in this, whether it was prescription drugs, women being left behind in the workforce, growing the economy, inflation, the watchdogs are back, the end of the pandemic as we have known it to be restrictive and altering our lives, right? We've heard him mention the NYPD. We heard him talk about ghost guns. We heard him talk about immigration reforms. I mean, he really went on different topics left and right. And so what I'll say is this: I'm happy that we are trying to get to this bipartisan place. And he mentioned that he passed 80 different bipartisan bills. And that is the way that our country needs to start to be able to push things to get things happen. And yet I will say that I'm disheartened just a little bit that I didn't hear more about Build Back Better. Our social services deserve the investment. It deserves the reform. And what I heard today was his new agenda around the unity agenda, which mentioned three things, particularly, the opiate crisis, mental health, and support for veterans. I believe that in order for our country to move forward, we have to make those reform and investments in our social structure, child welfare, and so forth. And I hope that we'll see more of that. I'm hoping that, tonight was, we didn't dig as far as we needed to go into those topics, and we'll see where it brings us. But to close our event, we want to leave you with a collective call to action, a letter from young people to the nation. So go to youngpeopleaddress.org to read and add your name to our cross movement letter. We need you to join us in building a bright future for young people. We want to thank all of the young people who are here today, thank the partners who are here, and thank everyone who tuned in tonight to the State of the Union to be able to be informed. Thank you, everyone, and good night.